All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're unpacking the absolute gold standard of electrical safety and execution. In this explainer, I'm going to lean on my 30 years of experience as a senior electrical commissioning and safety expert to walk you through the Saudi Electricity Company, or SEC, standards. We're looking at the entire life cycle today, from the very first site handover, straight through construction and testing, all the way to final energization. If you're looking to build an audit-ready, bulletproof permit-to-work system under SEC protocols, well, you're in exactly the right place. Let's get to it. We've got a tight roadmap for today, covering 5 critical phases. We'll start with site prep and handover, move into isolation and worksite safety, hit inspection and pre-commissioning, cover testing under a sanction for testing, and wrap up with permit closure and energization. Look, before anyone even thinks about signing a piece of paper or picking up a tool, we have to talk about physical safety. As OSHA lays out, assessing those physical hazards and actually wearing the right personal protective equipment, like your hard hats and fall protection, is the absolute non-negotiable foundation of site safety. Before any electrical work kicks off, you've got to run a comprehensive hazard identification and risk assessment, or HIRA, and get those safe work method statements locked in. Controlling the hazard at the source, that's always your best bet. But when you can't eliminate it entirely, your PPE is your absolute last line of defense. Okay, phase 1, site prep and handover. Let's talk about establishing authority and securing the site. You know, what's really fascinating here is how perfectly the SEC standard divides the power on a job site. It's a true separation of duties. You simply cannot have the same person handing over the keys and driving the car. On one side, you have the authorized issuer. This is an SEC employee with at least 5 years of hard experience, totally trained to operate the equipment, apply the physical isolations, and issue that permit to work. On the flip side is the authorized receiver. They take that permit, physically supervise the work, run the toolbox talks, and make sure every single competent worker on their crew is following the rules to the letter. Bottom line, absolutely zero work happens on a distribution network without this signed agreement. Moving right along to phase 2, isolation and worksite safety. This is all about lockout/tagout and approach boundaries. This, right here, this sequence is rigid, unbending, and completely non-negotiable. It's your audit-ready lockout/tagout procedure to make sure a system is totally de-energized. First, isolate all supply points, period. Second, slap on your safety locks and warning tags right at that primary energy source. Third, you have to use an approved voltage tester to verify zero voltage. That's your mandatory test before touch protocol. And finally, you apply protective earthing at every disconnection point. Why? To bleed off any of those nasty induced or capacitive voltages that might be lingering. I absolutely love the visual accountability the SEC requires for this. Honestly, a quick glance at the lock colors tells you exactly who is protecting what. The authorized issuer, they place the red lock. The authorized receiver places the yellow lock. And if you've got a competent person working on the system, they place a blue lock. When you've got a lot of folks involved, you use a multiple lock clamp. It's a brilliant system because it guarantees the power physically cannot be turned back on until every single person has finished their job and removed their specific lock. Now, let's put some real numbers to this, because when you're working near exposed, live conductors, these approach boundaries are literally a matter of life and death. Say you're near a 13.8 kV system. Your restricted approach boundary is exactly 660 millimeters, and your limited approach is 1.53 meters. Only the issuer, geared up in rated PPE and using an insulated hot stick, is allowed to breach those restricted boundaries to isolate a line. So whatever barriers you're setting up on site, they have to visually enforce these exact clearances. No exceptions. But, you know, sometimes the job physically demands that you push right up against those danger zones we just talked about. So what happens then? Well, that's when you use a limitation of access, or LOA. When a standard permit to work just doesn't fit the bill, the SOC issuer drafts this highly specific written instruction document. It acts as your safety lifeline, setting out exact boundaries to ensure that even when you're working uncomfortably close to live equipment, everything remains strictly controlled and fully compliant. All right, phase 3, inspection and pre-commissioning. The site is safe, so now we verify what we've built. Let's play the role of the inspector for a second and look at an actual SEC field checklist. Every single one of these boxes has to be ticked off. First, the mechanical side. Is that low voltage panel sitting perfectly level on a solid foundation? Then, the electrical checks. Are the LV cable terminations completely tight? Next, we verify the earthing. Is the LV neutral grounded? Are the meter boxes mounted securely and at the right height? Have we verified the customer ground bonding? This is your absolute final quality control checkpoint before you even think about introducing power. Okay, phase 4, testing under SFT. This is where we introduce a calculated, highly controlled risk into the system. To do this testing safely, we use a sanction for testing, or SFT. And I want to clarify why this is such a big deal. Back in the lockout phase, we applied protective earthing to make the equipment completely safe, right? Well, to test the insulation resistance, you mechanically have to take that grounding off. The SFT is the special SEC permit that allows you to temporarily remove the earthing and apply test voltages. It needs direct authorization from the control engineer, and honestly, it puts an immense amount of responsibility squarely on the authorized receiver running the test. I actually want to read this directly from the SEC's safety rules because it's essentially the golden rule of the SFT process. Any equipment that has been isolated and earthed for an SFT shall not be connected to the system until such equipment has passed the approved tests. It is that simple. You never, ever declare a system ready for energization until every single parameter has passed and the control engineer gives you the green light. And that brings us to the final stretch, Phase 5, Permit Closure and Energization. So, how do we get to that final ready for energization state? Well, closing the permit is just as strict as opening it. First, the receiver has to physically withdraw every worker, tool, and scrap of temporary material from the site. Second, they remove the portable protective earthing. Third, they actually sign the permit cancellation, officially declaring the equipment is no longer safe to touch. And finally, the issuer steps back in. They check that signature, visually verify the site is clear, remove the main grounding, and only then do they call the control engineer to bring the system to life. Now, as much as we follow these world-class procedures, we have to talk about worst-case scenarios. If someone gets shocked, you never, ever touch the victim directly. You grab an insulated hot stick immediately to separate them from the power. Check vitals, start CPR if they aren't breathing, and get the Saudi Red Crescent on the phone at 997. And please remember this CC rule. Even in the total chaos of an emergency, you do not start work on the network without a written permit. Bypassing the system in a panic, that just creates more victims. Which brings us to our final thought for today. We've gone through the HERAs, the strict LOTO sequences, the checklists, and the permit closures. Your paperwork might be flawlessly signed and your safety locks might be off, but I want you to step back and ask yourself, is your team truly ready for energization? Because real electrical safety is way more than just checking boxes on a SEC form. It takes a relentless culture of safety, constant training, and a deep respect for the power of electricity. Thanks for tuning into this explainer, and hey, stay safe out there.